The story of Congo is often overlooked for its complexity. It's a story where boundaries are porous and national identities meet little. Militant groups endeavor-changing acronyms are not who they claim to be, and neighbors loot and murder while they are praised as international opponents. But the death toll is now surpassing that of the Holocaust, because of the way the United States has evolved itself in Africa. Now facing a critical juncture in their history, the Congolese people need us to change the way we're involved so that they can have the space to start building the country.
The first principle to understand about the Congo: the affairs of the Congo have not been determined by the people of the Congo. The national boundaries were formed at the Berlin Conference in 1885, when Congo was given to King Leopold II of Belgium as his own personal property.
He owned it for 23 years, and during that time made a huge fortune off the territory, estimated at well over $1 billion in today's American dollars, primarily from turning people into forced laborers to gather ivory and also wild rubber.
As the Belgians were pursuing ivory and rubber, though, they discovered lots of gold deposits, diamonds, copper, cobalt, and many other minerals.
So, since 1885, Congo's been caught in the midst of a geostrategic battle, primarily for her natural resources.
Part of its ongoing conflict has been the desire of different armed groups in neighboring countries to benefit, to get rich, to make money from those particular minerals.
These resources that are found in the Congo are vital to major industries in the West. We're talking about the automotive industry, aerospace industry, technology industry, the electronics industry, even the jewelry industry.
These minerals exist in great profusion throughout the Democratic Republic of Congo, especially in its eastern part. And this is the largest territory on Earth which really doesn't have a functioning government.
People can say anything, but the Congo is still a police state. There is no freedom of the press. You hear people being killed. The army is not an army. You know, this is a bunch of people who are indisciplined, who still roam the streets.
But all this 125 years must be taken into consideration to fully understand why Congo is in a weakened state today. If we look from 1885 to 1908, we're talking about personal rule, enslavement. From 1908 to 1960, colonialism, Congo under colonial rule. Congo finally elects its leader in 1960, and in 61 was assassinated. So we have assassination. Then a dictator was put over the people for another 3 decades. So now we have dictatorship. Then an invasion was backed from the outside with Rwanda and Uganda in 1996 that Congolese people suffer from to this day. So we have 125 years of this. And what that does is it destroys and eviscerates the Congolese institutions.
When you have great wealth, but no government, it's an open invitation. It's been sort of a free-for-all war, as rival warlords surrounding African countries like Rwanda and Uganda in the east have just gone in there and helped themselves with this enormous natural wealth.
Since 1996, the conflict in Congo has claimed the lives of an estimated 6 million people. Today, neighboring governments continue plundering by using proxy forces to displace entire communities for access to the land. Scenes like this are often misunderstood as simply the result of an ethnic war, a mistake that only benefits those trying to hide their illegal exploits.
It has nothing to do with ethnicity. They killed Congolese
like they were flies. You see how people feed a mosquito into skin? That's exactly how they kill it. It does not mean anything to them how they were killing people. So as long as you can just wipe them out, you get access into the minds. People used to live in those areas. Have we ever asked who was living where the mine was before? Did the mine just show up? No, there were villages where those mines were.
1996, the president estimated 6 million dead. Abject poverty, people living in bestial conditions, hundreds of thousands of women systematically raped as a strategy of war.
Rape happened to be one of the weapons that works the most, because as soon as you destabilize a community, you rape the entire village, the women of the entire village, in front of the children, in front of the husband, in front of the neighbors. That community is broken completely, because the man cannot look at the wife in the eye and say, we were unable to protect you, and the women cannot survive that trauma.
Congo is one of the worst places in the world to be a woman or a girl. And one of my recent trips to Congo, I met up with a young girl who was 15 years old. She had been violently raped by one of the rebel groups, and she had been held for 3 months in a hole in the ground, in a pit, naked. And every day, another combatant would come and rape her. She was only 15, and she realized at one stage that she had fallen pregnant. And then they killed her best friend who was in the pit with her, the two of them. And she had to stay in that pit with the body for 6 weeks, unable to climb out of the pit, knowing that she was pregnant and still being raped day in, day out.
Since 1996, hundreds of thousands of Congolese women and girls have been raped, and the violence is escalating. Their attackers are foreign or Congolese, the lines between them blurred by years of greed, chaos, and impunity. As the women are broken, so is the community. The war strategy leaves tens of thousands of people dead every month.
They reduce you to a non-human, in essence. People are being reduced to a non-human so that they can think, they can feel powerless, they can feel hopeless, so they can give up.
Imagine, I mean, you may not even be able to put your wrap your mind around it, but imagine nearly 6 million people dying in the middle of Europe, and yet we're silent.
No great purchase in the
Why is it that nobody's talking about it? This is the same international community that said, you know, when there was a Holocaust, that no more genocide would take place, and yet the same community left Rwanda genocide take place, and yet those who committed genocide in Rwanda crossed over in the Congo, and the Congo has become the victim of what happened in Rwanda, and what the international community didn't do to stop it.
In 1994, the international community failed to stop the Rwandan genocide and effectively punish its perpetrators. Since then, violence in Central Africa has escalated, along with a growing culture of impunity.
If you don't hold to account those who carry out these horrible atrocities, it leaves the door open for them to do more.
Free to flee the country, hundreds of militants crossed over into Congo for fear of retribution from the Tutsi-led rebellion that took power in Rwanda. The militants were hidden among millions of predominantly civilian Hutu refugees trying to escape the violence in their country.
The refugee camps, which had over 1 million people in them, were being controlled by these very same genocidaires, these people who committed the genocide.
Paul Kagame, who led the Tutsi rebellion and was now in charge of Rwanda, saw these militant refugees as a threat to Rwandan national security.
He came to Washington, D.C., essentially said, if the international international community is not going to do it. We're going to take things into our own hands. The U.S. had no official response to that, which he interpreted as a green light.
In the absence of justice, a terrifying cycle of revenge was about to take hold in Congo, as Paul Kagame's army prepared to massacre what many experts estimate to be hundreds of thousands of refugees.
Reports started coming in about atrocities that had been committed, in which they had slaughtered thousands of Hutu civilians. Now, believe me, I have no sympathy whatsoever for these genocidaires, these Interahamwe guys who had, committed the genocide in Rwanda. But the civilians, obviously, the children, the women, are you kidding? Why would they be victimized by this?
These Hutu were not combatants. They were not people under arms. They were elderly. They were women. They were children. They were sick. They were killed in a systematic and highly motivated way. And the UN knew about it almost in real time.
The UN knew, the US government knew, I mean, other countries as well. They did not make an effort to openly investigate those who were not good enough. They allowed investigations to be blocked and they didn't push it. The question can be asked, why was that the case? And of course, part of the difficulty was that many policymakers felt guilty. They hadn't done enough to stop the Rwandan genocide. And that genocide guilt allowed them to cover this up.
That guilt manifested in the Clinton era in an extremely pro-Rwanda policy, which essentially allowed the new government in Rwanda to do whatever they wanted, both within their country and within Congo, with impunity.
With the leaders of the United States and the United Nations looking the other way, Kagame proceeded with a full-scale invasion of Congo with his Ugandan ally, Yoweri Museveni.
So the question is, what role did the U.S. play in this? And it was a pretty direct supporting role. I happened to go to Rwanda just before this invasion took place, and major shipments of weapons were coming in at night to support the Rwandan army. We had places in the country that trained Rwandan army troops, and in short, we were supporting the invasion.
The United States, what they decided to do in the final analysis was to support an invasion of Congo.
In this case, you had Rwanda and Uganda invading their neighbor, plundering it of its natural resource wealth, and suffering no sanctions at the United Nations Security Council. And you have to ask why. And it's because they had the very strong support and backing of the United States, the United Kingdom, and other governments.
The reason the United States supported Rwanda and Uganda in their invasion of Congo cannot simply be attributed to genocide guilt. The U.S. had economic and political motivations as well. One reason for our involvement extended back to our support of Mobutu Sese Seko, a dictator we helped install in Congo and supported for 32 years.
This man led his country proud. He extracted even more money from it than people did in his time. Mobutu got a longer reign and a much more developed economy to plunder. And the United States was deeply complicit in that because we supported Mobutu lock, stock, and barrel.
And after the Cold War ended, essentially in 1989, 1990, many of his backers, including the United States government and the French government, essentially abandoned him. He became a liability to them because he had such a bad human rights record.
When Mobutu became an embarrassment, we helped Rwanda and Uganda overthrow him and install another dictator and another. Now the Congolese people are victims of a corrupt dictatorial network which receives financial support from the United States.
They have looted the place outrageously, taking hundreds of millions of dollars in loans, sponsoring some of the worst war crimes, and with never a protest from Washington.
The role the U.S. plays in Central Africa is complex. Historically, we've maintained influence in the area for access to minerals on which our economy and military rely.
our connection to the